Trapped between Swedish and Russian armies, the garrison of Revel opened their gates to neither. Instead, they sealed themselves inside and raised the black flag. When the doors were forced months later, everyone inside was dead, smiling. In the year 1710, the fortress city of Revel becomes the most terrifying place on the frozen edge of the world. Two colossal empires, Russia and Sweden, circle the stone walls like starving wolves waiting for a kill that never comes. But inside the fortifications, something far more ancient and hungry has already claimed the prize, turning a strategic jewel into a nightmare. The Great Northern War had reached its boiling point, a decade of blood and iron that had turned the Baltic into a graveyard of ambitions. Peter the Great, the iron-willed Tsar of Russia, had fixed his eyes upon this limestone stronghold, seeing it as the final lock on his window to the west. Outside the massive walls, 80,000 Russian troops dug their trenches into the Estonian mud, a suffocating ring of steel intended to starve the Swedish garrison into submission. The air should have been filled with the thunder of 300 cannons and the frantic screams of a traditional siege, yet an eerie, heavy stillness settled over the landscape like a thick layer of grave ash. The soldiers in the Russian camps watched the ramparts daily, expecting the defiant flags of the Swedish crown to dip in surrender or wave in challenge, but what they saw instead defied every logic of military engagement. The gates remained barred and silent, yet not a single musket was fired from the loopholes to keep the invaders at bay. Inside the city, the atmosphere had shifted from the frantic energy of defense to a damp, claustrophobic despair that no blade could pierce. A third force, an invisible conqueror that had traveled in the bellies of rats and the hidden seams of merchant ships, had arrived to claim the garrison for itself. It was the Black Death, returning with a virulence not seen in 4 generations, and it moved through the narrow, winding alleys of Revel like a physical presence. It touched the young and the old, the soldier and the merchant, leaving behind the signature mark of the abyss, the swollen, blackened buboes that bloomed like dark flowers on the necks and groins of the doomed. The clean smell of the Baltic salt was quickly replaced by the sickeningly sweet odor of gangrene and the acrid, useless smoke of medicinal fires burning on every street corner. In the dark basements of the majestic limestone houses, the skin of the dying turned a bruised, midnight purple, and the sounds of the city were reduced to a low, wet rattling in 10,000 throats. The Russian generals outside waited for the white flag of truce, but as the weeks turned into months, they realized that Revel had stopped communicating with the world of the living altogether. They were no longer besieging a strategic fortress, they were staring at a monumental coffin of stone and mortar, a place where the line between the living and the dead had become a blurred, terrifying smear. The stage was set for a transformation so dark that it would make the slaughter of the battlefield look like an act of mercy. This was only the beginning of the end for Revel, a city that was about to seal its own fate and raise a banner that signaled a departure from the world of men into a realm of silent, smiling horror. The Swedish garrison stands atop the limestone ramparts of Revel, their breath blooming in the bitter air of 1710 like ghostly shrouds. To the east, the horizon is a jagged line of orange fire where 30,000 Russian soldiers under Tsar Peter the Great wait for the city to starve into submission. The Baltic wind screams across the Gulf of Finland, carrying the stinging scent of freezing salt, wet gunpowder, and the unmistakable, sickly sweet rot of impending doom. These men are veterans of the Great Northern War, hardened by a decade of slaughter from Narva to Poltava, yet they do not look at the Russian cannons with traditional fear. Instead, they look inward, toward the dark, winding alleys of the city behind them, where a silent, invisible enemy has already breached the walls without firing a single shot. Inside the heavy limestone houses, the air has grown thick and stagnant, vibrating with the low, rhythmic moans of those whose skin has turned the color of bruised plums. The Swedish commanders, once proud and disciplined, now walk the battlements with glazed eyes, their uniforms stained not with the mud of the trenches, but with the dark, weeping fluids of a sickness that defies every prayer and every doctor. Then, in a moment that freezes the blood of the Russian scouts watching from the distant woods, the heavy iron gates of the fortress begin to move. There is no herald, no trumpet call, and no offer of surrender. There is only the agonizing, metallic shriek of rusted hinges as the massive oak and iron barriers groan shut for the final time in human history. The sound echoes across the frozen landscape like the lid of a stone sarcophagus being hammered into place. From within, the massive crossbars are dropped into their iron cradles by hands that tremble with the final, frantic strength of the damned. These are hands that will never touch a latch or a key again, belonging to men who have realized that their only remaining duty is to die in private. As the echoes of the heavy timber die away, a suffocating silence falls over the city of Revel, more terrifying than any bombardment. Then, slowly, almost lazily, a single black flag rises above the highest battlement of the Maiden Tower. It is not the blue and yellow of Sweden, nor the tricolor of the Russian Tsar. It is a void of blackened silk that snaps in the freezing gale, a silent, terrifying signal to the world that Revel no longer belongs to the living, the Swedish crown, or the warring kings. The city has declared its independence from the world of men, surrendering instead to the ancient, faceless sovereignty of the pestilence. The soldiers outside realize with a jolt of primal horror that they are no longer besieging a strategic fortress, but guarding a massive, self-inflicted tomb that has decided to lock itself from the inside. Within the limestone ribs of Revel, the very air begins to thicken, turning into something heavy, sweet, and utterly lethal. The sun, a pale and sickly disk in the Estonian sky of 1710, offers no warmth to the narrow alleys where the shadows have stopped moving. Time itself seems to have curdled inside the fortress walls, detaching the city from the timeline of empires and wars. The first thing to mutate is the soundscape of the city. The sharp, metallic ring of Swedish steel, the rhythmic stomp of boots, and the bark of military commands are swallowed by a low, subterranean chanting that seems to rise from the sewer grates and the damp cellar floors. It is a sound that bypasses the ears and vibrates directly in the marrow of the bone, a collective, hypnotic drone of thousands of souls leaning into the abyss together. This terrifying vibration is punctuated only by the wet, rattling coughs of the dying, a biological percussion that marks the passing of every hour in the dark. These are no longer the sounds of a garrison preparing for battle, they are the sounds of a massive, urban cathedral being built out of expiring breath and agony. The plague does not merely infect the inhabitants, it colonizes the architecture itself, moving through the narrow cobblestone streets like a visible, sentient fog. This miasma, a gray and clinging vapor, hugs the ground and swirls around the legs of the few who still walk, carrying with it the heavy, cloying scent of putrefaction and burnt herbs. It turns the once vibrant markets, where merchants from across the Baltic once traded fine furs and silver, into open, festering pits of blackened flesh and weeping sores. The stalls that once held exotic spices are now piled high with the bodies of the wealthy and the poor alike, their limbs intertwined in a final, horrific embrace. The physical transformation of the people is total and grotesque. Skin turns the color of a bruised plum before splitting open to leak the dark, infectious fluids of the Great Death. Eyes that once looked for the sails of rescue ships now stare vacantly at the sky, clouded over by the haze of the pestilence. Yet, despite the mounting horror, a strange and unsettling phenomenon takes hold within the walls. No one tries to escape over the battlements. No desperate refugees attempt to scale the walls to beg for the mercy of the Russian cannons or the Swedish cavalry waiting in the distance. The ropes and ladders that should have been used for flight remain coiled and rotting in the salt air. It is as if the inhabitants of Revel have found a dark, delirious peace in their absolute isolation. They have accepted the plague as a new and final sovereign, one more powerful than Tsar Peter or King Charles. Inside the sealed city, the social order has dissolved into a terrifying spiritual ecstasy. The dying are not shunned, they are cradled. The healthy do not flee the sick, they join them in their rhythmic, droning prayers, waiting for their own skin to blossom with the dark flowers of the infection. Outside, the world continues to burn, but inside Revel, the war has ended. The generals waiting in the trenches, less than a mile away, listen to the silence of the city and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the Baltic wind. They see the black flag snapping in the gale and wait for a surrender that will never come, because those inside are no longer citizens of any earthly kingdom. The inhabitants have entered a state of collective trance, a mass surrender to the inevitable that feels less like a defeat and more like a dark ascension. They have turned their fortress into a tomb, and they have locked the door from the inside, choosing the certain embrace of the great death over the uncertain cruelty of men. In the markets of Revel, among the mounds of the fallen, the only thing that moves is the fog, dancing over the grinning faces of 10,000 corpses who seem to know a secret that the living cannot comprehend. By the autumn of 1710, the earth surrounding the fortress of Revel has transformed into a viscous, waist-deep sea of black mud and freezing rain. Two of the most formidable military machines in human history, the expanding Russian Empire and the iron-willed Swedish kingdom, find themselves locked in a state of unnatural, soul-crushing paralysis. For 30 days, and then 60, and then 90, tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers sit in their sodden trenches, their bayonets rusting and their spirits eroding under the weight of a silence so heavy it feels like a physical shroud. They had come to this Baltic shore expecting the thunder of 1,000 cannons and the glorious carnage of a standard siege, but instead, they have found a void that defies every rule of engagement they were ever taught. The Russian camps, overseen by the grim and expectant generals of Peter the Great, stretch across the horizon in a sprawling grid of misery, while the Swedish reinforcements watch from the freezing coastline, yet neither side dares to fire a single shot. Between them stands the city, a massive limestone sarcophagus rising out of the mist, its gates bolted with a finality that suggests they were never meant to be opened again. There is no sign of life within those walls, no desperate cries for bread, and most terrifyingly, no smoke rising from the thousands of chimneys that prick the grey Estonian sky. In the 18th century, a city without smoke is a city without a pulse. It means the hearths are cold, the kitchens are empty, and the living have ceased to care about the biting winter chill. The only thing that moves in the entire landscape is that singular, obsidian banner, the black flag of the plague, which flaps and snaps against the wind like the wings of a predatory bird circling a dying animal. The sound of that fabric tearing at the air is the only heartbeat the city has left, a rhythmic, mocking reminder that the inhabitants of Revel have chosen a different master than any king or czar. In the dead of night, the soldiers in the trenches swear they can hear the city breathing, a low, wet, rattling sound that carries on the salt spray, convincing the most superstitious among them that the stone walls are no longer protecting people, but are instead containing a monster that has already finished its meal. In the command tents, the atmosphere is even more toxic, thick with the smell of cheap brandy and the mounting desperation of men who realize they are losing a war to an invisible ghost. The generals of the two greatest empires in Europe, men who have commanded charges at Poltava and weathered the bloodiest winters of the north, now spend their hours huddled over maps that have become utterly meaningless. They argue with trembling voices over the spoils of a city they are now too terrified to set foot in, debating the ownership of gold and ports that might as well be on the surface of the moon. They speak of strategic maneuvers and territorial claims, but their eyes constantly drift to the horizon, staring at the fortress with a mixture of greed and absolute, primal horror. They are no longer commanders of men, they are jailers of a tomb, watching over a self-inflicted prison where the very air has fermented into a lethal, invisible poison. The military doctors speak in hushed, frightened tones about the miasma, believing that the concentrated essence of 10,000 deaths has seeped into the very masonry of the fort, creating a cloud of pestilence so thick it could choke an army before they even reached the inner courtyard. Rumors ripple through the ranks like a contagion, whispered stories of Swedish sentries who looked through telescopes and saw figures standing perfectly still on the ramparts for days at a time, their skin the color of bruised plums and their eyes fixed on the camps below with an expression that wasn't fear, but something closer to a hideous, enlightened joy. The siege has ceased to be a tactical operation and has become a psychological abyss, a waiting game where the prize is a wasteland and the cost is a slow, agonizing transformation of the soul. The empires are frozen, their flags limp in the rain, while the black banner of Revel continues its relentless, triumphant dance against the grey, oblivious to the world of the living that stands paralyzed at its feet. The heavy silence that had radiated from the fortress for months finally becomes a weight so unbearable that the Russian commanders can no longer restrain their men. The orders are barked across the muddy lines, and the heavy battering ram is dragged forward through the slush of a dying winter in 1710. Every soldier in the breaching party expects a hail of musket fire, the splash of boiling pitch, or at the very least, the desperate screams of a starving garrison fighting for their lives. But as the first blow of the ram echoes against the iron-studded oak of the main gate, the only response is a hollow, rhythmic thud that vibrates through the stone foundations like a heartbeat in a tomb. The second strike cracks the primary beam, and the third sends the massive doors groaning inward, swinging on rusted hinges that scream in protest. As the gates fall, a wall of air rushes out from the interior of the fort, but it is not the stench of a charnel house that first hits the invaders. Instead, they are met by a suffocating, cloying cloud of sweetness so thick it feels like a physical hand pressing against their throats. The air is heavy with the scent of mountains of dried lavender, crushed rose petals, and the sharp, resinous sting of expensive frankincense and myrrh. It is the smell of a cathedral during a high mass, a perfume so concentrated it makes the soldiers' eyes water and their lungs burn. Beneath this floral veil, however, lurks a darker, vibrating note, the low, sweet, and sickly rot of 10,000 bodies that have been fermenting in the stillness for months. As the soldiers step over the threshold, their boots clicking on the pristine cobblestones, the horror of Revel reveals itself not as a scene of war, but as a grotesque masquerade. There are no barricades in the streets, no overturned carts, and no piles of discarded weapons. The city is clean, almost unnervingly so, but it is populated by a silent, motionless aristocracy of the damned. Every single person the soldiers encounter, from the highest-ranking Swedish officer to the lowliest street sweeper, is dressed in their absolute finest Sunday attire. Men lean against the limestone walls of the great guild hall wearing waistcoats of embroidered silk and breeches of fine Spanish leather, their lace cravats still white against their blackened, shrunken necks. Women sit in high-backed chairs in the middle of the squares, draped in heavy velvet gowns of crimson and emerald, their cold fingers still clutching silver-handled fans or strands of Baltic amber. It is as if the entire population of 10,000 souls reached a collective, whispered agreement to meet their end not as victims of a microscopic parasite, but as guests at a royal gala. In the central market, tables have been dragged out from the surrounding houses and lined up to form a singular, mile-long banquet board. Silver candelabras stand tarnished by the salt air, holding stubs of beeswax candles that guttered out months ago. There is no food on the pewter plates, only the dust of time, yet the people sit around the tables in perfect, chilling formation. A mother in a dress of blue damask sits with her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy in a miniature velvet coat, their sightless eyes turned toward the empty head of the table. The soldiers walk through this forest of silk and rot in a trance of pure terror, realizing that this was not a chaotic collapse of a civilization, but a curated, ritualistic exit from the world. The citizens of Revel had spent their final hours washing the filth of the plague from their skin, burning every grain of incense in the city's stores, and raiding their wardrobes for the most expensive fabrics they owned. They chose to die in a sanctuary of luxury rather than surrender to the armies waiting outside. The visual contrast of the exquisite, shimmering fabrics against the purple, bloated skin of the dead creates a cognitive dissonance that breaks the minds of the younger recruits, who begin to weep and pull at their own collars, suffocating in the perfume of a city that transformed its own extinction into a masterpiece of dark theater. 10,000 people remain frozen in this final, silent act of defiance, waiting for a royal feast that was never meant to arrive, leaving the conquerors to realize they have not won a fortress, but have merely inherited a beautifully dressed graveyard. The heavy iron-reinforced gates do not groan when they finally give way, they scream, the rusted hinges shrieking like the thousands who perished behind these stone walls. As the first wave of Russian soldiers crosses the threshold, their boots clicking nervously against the pristine cobblestones, the expected smell of a besieged city is absent. There is no scent of gunpowder, no iron tang of fresh blood, and no smoke from the fires of desperate resistance. Instead, the air is thick and cloying, a heavy shroud of dried lavender, expensive frankincense, and the sweet, suffocating odor of ancient lilies that seems to coat the back of the throat. The invaders move in a tight formation, their muskets leveled at shadows that do not move, their eyes darting between the narrow Gothic windows of the silent houses. There are no snipers on the roofs and no barricades in the squares. The silence is absolute, a physical weight that presses against the ears until the sound of a single soldier's breath feels like a thunderclap. When the officers finally raise their lanterns to pierce the unnatural gloom of the town square, the light reveals a scene that defies every law of war and every mercy of God. 10,000 souls inhabit the fortress of Revel, and not one of them is standing. They are everywhere, slumped against the stone fountains, seated in neat rows along the church steps, and leaned against the timber frames of their shops. But they are not the ragged, skeletal remains of a starving population. The people of Revel are dressed in their absolute finest, a macabre parade of silk, velvet, and gold brocade that glitters mockingly in the flickering lantern light. Noblewomen lie in the gutters wearing emerald-studded gowns, their hands folded neatly over prayer books. Soldiers of the Swedish garrison sit at their posts, their polished breastplates reflecting the terrified faces of the men who came to kill them. It is as if the entire city had paused in the middle of a grand, celestial ball to simply lie down and wait. The true horror, however, is not found in the stillness, but in the expressions frozen upon their faces. As the invaders lean closer, their hearts hammering against their ribs, they realize that not a single victim of this Black Death bears a mask of agony or a trace of fear. There are no furrowed brows or twisted limbs of the suffering. Every man, woman, and child in the fort is locked in a wide, glassy-eyed grin. Their mouths are stretched upward into impossible, eternal smiles, revealing teeth that flash white in the darkness. It is a mass of silent, mocking laughter that seems to erupt from the very earth. The soldiers recoil, some dropping their weapons in a panic, as they realize they are not looking at a graveyard, but a theater of the absurd. This was not a surrender, it was a final, delirious ecstasy. In the final months of the year 1710, the people of Revel looked at the two empires waiting to enslave them and chose a different master. They embraced the madness of the pestilence with such fervor that the plague ceased to be a curse and became a release. They died in a state of horrific joy, a collective fever dream that transformed their final breaths into a joke shared at the expense of the living. The invaders stand amidst the sea of grinning corpses, realizing that while they have taken the stone and the earth of the fortress, the souls of Revel escaped them months ago, departing with a smile that will haunt the history of the Baltic for 1,000 years. There is no victory here, only the hollow echo of a laugh that will never end.